Hello, and welcome to Michael's Minty Music for today. Today we are reviewing Ummagumma by Pink Floyd. It's their second 1969 album. They released two albums in 1969, and half of the album is live recordings of previously released tracks, and the other half is new tracks, recorded in the studio album tracks. It's not embarrassing for Pink Floyd, but it's not really a great album. This is the track listing. With sides 1 and 2, you see they're labeled live, and sides 3 and 4 are labeled studio. And these are the tracks I added to my playlist, only two off of the studio side. I usually don't really bother with adding live tracks to my playlist, since I don't really want to clutter up my playlist with different versions of the same songs. So I usually don't really touch those in terms of adding them to my playlist. I did enjoy side 1 and 2. They were all right. Most of the non-live tracks on the album are purely instrumental though, and they're not particularly interesting. It's mostly just experimental stuff that sort of sounds okay, but I would never choose intentionally to listen to it. Um, so for that reason, my favorite song here is Grantchester Meadows. It's really the only non-really instrumental song on studio song on the album. Um, so it's kind of, I mean, in that case, but it's also a pretty decent song. It's got a nice slow groove, and it's pretty similar to Cymbeline off of More, their previous album. Um, the song that ends side 3, which I'm not gonna say because it would take too long, is the only one that's really interesting experimentally. The other songs, Grantchester Meadows is the only non-instrumental. Well, The Narrow Way has some vocals in it, but for the most part, it's the only one that really has lyrics. So it's really kind of a little bit above most of the kind of meh instrumental songs. But The Narrow Way wasn't as bad as I expected it to be, but the other ones, especially Sisyphus, was not great. And in terms of the rankings, this is definitely the worst Pink Floyd album I've listened to so far, especially if you only consider the studio side. It's just not as interesting. In the effort to be experimental, this album is actually relatively boring. It's just sort of sound. And as expected, this album does not take my top spot from 1969. That stays with the Beatles' Abbey Road, which is clearly better. Uh, Ummagumma has like one song, and Abbey Road has a bunch. And next up, we have the Beatles' last album, Let It Be, released in 1970. It's pretty good considering that they were in the process of breaking up their band at the time. It still comes together pretty well, and I mean, it's still good. Even the Beatles not really working well together is still pretty good. So stay tuned for that, and as always, stay minty.